Welcome to Cybersecurity Today. I'm Jim Wiggins, your host, guiding you through the complex realm of cybersecurity. For those joining us for the first time, here's a brief introduction to our program. This program explores the multifaceted world of cybersecurity. Leveraging my background in the field, I'm going to present insightful and engaging discussions on a range of computer security topics. Each 30-minute episode follows a talk show or news segment format addressing various themes, issues, and the latest advancements in cybersecurity. Targeted at an audience from novices to experts, our show includes valuable insights and perspectives from leading professionals at the forefront of cybersecurity trends. Our mission is to serve a diverse audience, ensuring that both beginners and seasoned experts find each episode informative and engaging. Our program is typically divided into two distinct segments. The first segment is entitled Cyber Bites, and its focuses on contemporary issues and trends that are currently shaping the cybersecurity industry. In our second segment, we're pleased to welcome Mr. Tyler Harding, who will discuss Securing the Future, Understanding ISO 27001, 27002, 2022 edition. All right, let's delve into the Cyber Bytes segment and uncover some of the most current events today in the cybersecurity world. In current news, the notorious Black Basta ransomware group has claimed responsibility for cyber attacks on two major US firms, Key Benefit Administrators, and Scrubs and Beyond. The gang asserts it has gained access to sensitive client, executive, and employee data amounting to 2.5 terabytes and 500 gigabytes respectively from these respective organizations. These alleged breaches involving a financial services firm and a healthcare apparel retailer highlight significant cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Authorities are investigating the claims, and the affected companies have yet to release official statements. In other news, an unknown adversary has potentially accessed critical information on U.S. chemical facilities by exploiting vulnerabilities in the CISA Chemical Security Assessment Tool, sometimes referred to as CSAT. The breach, which occurred in January of this year, may have exposed sensitive data, including chemical inventories, security assessments, and personnel information. Although CISA's investigation found no evidence of data exfiltration, the compromised systems underscore significant cybersecurity risks. Authorities urge affected facilities to review and enhance their cybersecurity measures to prevent further exploitation. In other news, the notorious Lockbit ransomware group alleges it has breached the U.S. Federal Reserve System, claiming to have exfiltrated 33 terabytes of sensitive banking data. Announced on their dark web leak site on June 3, 2024, the group threatened to release the stolen information unless specific demands are met. Cybersecurity experts remain skeptical of these claims, noting the absence of any sample data to substantiate the breach. The Federal Reserve has yet to confirm or deny the alleged attack, which, if true, could have severe implications for financial stability and national security. That concludes the headlines making news today. We're going to take a brief interlude and return with our guest, Mr. Tyler Harding, to delve into Securing the Future, Understanding ISO 27001, 27002, the 2022 edition. Stick around and we'll reconvene right here after the break.
With liberty and justice for all. Does that mean bunnies? And puppies?
Every year, thousands of companion animals and billions of factory farm and lab animals are legally abused and killed. But this can be stopped. Tell Congress to support sensible, humane laws. Sign the Animal Bill of Rights now.
Don't forget the puppies.
Welcome back to Cybersecurity Today. Joining us now is Mr. Tyler Harding, an information security principal who until recently was with Amazon.com services. With over 20 years of professional experience, Tyler has a distinguished career in cybersecurity and compliance. He led Amazon Business's security and compliance efforts, supporting the organization's ISO 27001 certification and SOC 2 attestation efforts. Before his role at Amazon Business, Tyler led Amazon's multi-channel fulfillment, sometimes known as MCF, to achieve its first ISO 27001 certification and SOC 2 reports. Before MCF, Tyler managed AWS Security's DoD Security and Compliance Program, ensuring AWS's cloud services were authorized by the Defense Information Systems Agency, also known as DISA. His expertise spans commercial security compliance, federal security requirements, IT audits, privacy reviews, and network security penetration tests. Tyler has also served as an IT principal at Carney & Company, where he supported federal agencies' information security programs, and as a senior manager at KPMG, managing IT audit engagements and conducting training for IT professionals. Additionally, Tyler is an active educator, having taught and teaching the CISA certification review course for ISACA. Today, Tyler will discuss securing the future, understanding ISO 27001, 27002, the 2022 version. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jim. How are you?
Awesome. So glad that you can be here with us. I'm wondering if maybe we can start off with having you talk a little bit about how did your experience in, how did you build your experience in knowledge and security programs around ISO 27001, both the 2013 and the 2022 version?
My exposure with ISO 27001 began when I was at AWS. And as the manager of the DoD Security and Compliance Program, Amazon Web Services, AWS, was very much about like integration. So believe it or not, there are a lot of overlap between the DoD security requirements, which I was responsible for making sure our cloud services met, as well as the requirements from ISO 27001 and that earlier edition, the 2013 edition that we leveraged. And so because of that, I got my journey and start, back in 2019 with ISO 27001. And it's progressed as my career advanced through Amazon.
Understood. Can we talk a little bit about like why organizations would look at potentially adopting the 27001 standard and also like what kind of business value does it provide?
Sure. So ISO 27001 is, believe it or not, the most widely adopted international standard for information security. There's many standards out there, many different frameworks, but the ISO standard is the most popular, of them. It's very interesting in my perspective in terms of like the business value that there's a lot of overlap when you look at the similar commercial standards like in North America, like the SOC 2 or SOC 1, the systems and organizational control reports. And then you get over into the federal space, there's a publication from NIST called a Special Publication 800-171. We've heard a lot about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC. In prior versions of the CMMC, all 110 controls, mapped to what was originally 114 controls in ISO 2013 edition, and now in the 2022 edition, there are 94 controls. So we're getting down to 2 or 3 controls differences, but there's a great deal of overlap. So organizations can, do once and reuse many. And so for anyone who has customers that are not only North America based, you may have customers internationally in the UK, in part of the EU. They require ISO. And believe it or not, even in Asia, Japan, Korea, Singapore, I've seen government procurements mandate that a bidder have an ISO certification and specifically call out the 27001 standard. So the value is from your sales organization by doing it once in this international standard, you can position your organization to be able to sell globally to customers that have maybe higher levels of security requirements. So that's one of the basic business values to a sales organization. And of course, the other value is like, let's raise our security bar. We have a lot of good security practices, but are there any gaps? And as risks evolve and we need to make sure that our security program adapts to those evolving risks. And so the 2022 standard really has evolved to address new threats, particularly things like ransomware, where previously that wasn't an attack vector or a concern we were so much worried about, of like losing your data and then having to buy it back. So there's a lot of developments with that newer standard that helps organizations raise their bar to a higher level of security.
Understood. I know there's a certification for it for organizations. How does that certification compare to other organizational certifications that the company might pursue?
Sure. So I would encourage organizations to all take a look at the ISO 27001. It's a great starting block. The most advantageous part about ISO 27001 is it's risk-based. There are other organizational standards that require that you do all of the controls and all of them have to be implemented. With ISO 27001, one of the core tenets is starting a risk-based approach. So you can tailor the security controls to your environment and still be considered certified. I'll give you an example of like an organization might have applications that are their tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3. They have different levels of availability requirements. In some other certifications, because maybe a tier 1 app contains privacy data and you have a tier 3 app that contains privacy data, both the tier 1 app and the tier 3 app would have to implement the same level of availability controls because of that high watermark perception. Where in the ISO, it allows you to be flexible and say, that's nice to have for a tier 3 app, but it's not tier 1, so we're not going to put as much resources and rigor into those controls for availability. But we'll still have the same controls for encryption, for data at rest, data in transit.
Understood. Can we talk for a moment about cost? I mean,
Sure.
so there's obviously a cost associated with implementing a program like ISO 27001. What would an organization look at in terms of cost structures for implementing a program? Is there any general ideas?
So you really have to consider like 4 factors when you look at costs for ISO 27001. The first is going to be just the initial cost of like standing up a information security management system, which ISMS, or we refer to that often as a cybersecurity program. And so there's going to be some basic documentation. You're going to have to make sure your organizational policies and procedures, meet the mandatory clauses of ISO 27001. And then there's some other documentation for Annex A, which is the ISO 27002, and that's the control catalog, which today has 94 controls. Again, you don't have to implement all 94. It's a risk-based approach. You may decide that some controls aren't applicable to your organization. And so you have that cost. So that initial implementation cost. And then after you do that initial assessment implementation, you're going to want to make sure before you go for an external audit that you're actually ready. And so it's recommended that you do a gap assessment to see how close you are. You categorize your findings as like major nonconformities, minor nonconformities, and opportunities for improvement. So use those 3 types of buckets. Minor nonconformities and opportunities for improvement won't block certification, but a major nonconformity would block. And so, to your cost question, your gap assessment can be anywhere between $25,000 to $100,000, right? That's initial. And so again, you have to remediate some of this, certainly the major nonconformities. And so that cost, I'm not sure about the remediation. But in addition to your initial year, you've got that gap assessment. ISO 27001 requires 2 assessments every year. There's an internal audit requirement, which needs to be done by a competent person who understands ISO 27001. And they'll go through all 94 controls, in that framework. Again, it's based on your statement of applicability. So there may be some controls of that 94 that don't apply to your environment. And so they may not have to do all 94. So it's not uncommon to have some controls that are not applicable, particularly if you use like a cloud service provider. There's a section of controls about physical security, right? Well, if all of your data, that's going to be covered by your cloud provider, right? You're not going to be responsible there. So those controls wouldn't be obviously applicable. And then, of course, in addition to the internal audit, you have the actual certification audit. And the certification audit is broken down into two phases, a stage 1 and a stage 2. And the stage 1 is really reviewing the policies, procedures to validate that your organization is ready for certification. And then the stage 2 actually evaluates the implementation of those controls. So when you step back, there's 4 things to consider. You've got that initial startup, the initial build the documentation to support an information security management system. The second thing is that gap assessment. Third thing is the internal audit. And then, of course, the fourth thing is the external certification audit. So that's the initial cost. And each one of those activities can range from $25,000 to $100,000, And so, it wouldn't be uncommon for a first-year customer to spend $250,000 to, $500,000 in the initial year. Subsequent years are going to be significantly less because you've built that foundation.
Understood. So we've talked about the benefit of the program and some of the implementation considerations. Can we talk about, just from an operational perspective, how the standard actually helps organizations improve their cybersecurity posture? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's like 2 real key benefits. The first one is the requirement for like a risk assessment. A lot of organizations have not taken to heart, doing that assessment and going, where are we? Do we have a comprehensive, security program? So that risk assessment helps identify gaps, and then helps you build what's required as a risk register. So that's the first part. And then, of course, the ISO 27000, the 2022 edition, addressed some of the new emerging risks. And like one of the big ones is the adoption of cloud services. So there's a new controls in that. So consider cloud services, consideration of privacy, which is an evolving area, as well, particularly from a regulatory compliance perspective. So you get some benefits, from not only raising your security bar, you get the feedback loop of like a risk assessment, as well as you get, make sure that you're actually going to be compliant with the laws of the states or nations that you operate in.
Understood. Let's talk about implementation. So what are the steps that you kind of laid out, some of the steps involved, but are there other kind of procedural mechanisms that would be important when you're rolling out 27001 to an organization?
Sure. I think it's really, really important to work backwards when you want to decide about the certification, because there are significant costs involved. And having done this 3 times now, the first thing is asking, who's the audience for the ISO 27001? Is it going to be your present customers? Are those the one asking for it? Or is it, are you anticipating future customers? You're entering new markets. And that question of, what is the scope of the certification? Obviously, the larger the scope, the more costly it is, because the scope can be considered very narrow to just a software development team, or it could be the entire organization, or it could be just a subgroup within it. You can also consider what locations that are physically going to be. You may have software development centers. Are all the software development centers going to be included? So you have the physical locations. You also have the products. If you choose to include products, in the scope, that costs money. So the more products, the deeper the auditors will dive. So working backwards, the first set is setting the boundaries for your scope, and getting that certificate statement, figuring out in your mind. And then, of course, from proceeding from that, you're going to work to build your ISMS documentation. And those are big efforts. Building the documentation, then that kind of leads you to doing the gap assessment. You're going to look at your policies and procedures. Do they align with the ISO, the Annex A controls? Making sure that, of course, you have all of the processes in place that address the 6 core clauses in ISO 27001. So you have that effort to consider. And of course, moving from the gap, you get to the internal audit. And then, of course, you move to the external audit. So, that's a general, implementation, and it can take anywhere from you can do it as rapidly as 6 months to 2 years, depending on how urgent and how fast the organization wants to do.
Any thoughts on some of the challenges that organizations might face in terms of the implementation that you've seen or that you have heard about?
Sure, yeah. In large organizations, awareness of policies and procedures is typically the biggest challenge. In a large organization like Amazon, where teams are distributed across the world, I observed that some teams were very knowledgeable of specific policies and procedures, while other teams, were not. There's sometimes in policies and procedures, you'll identify as like, oh, there's a requirement to do an annual data recovery test. And I've observed that sometimes not everyone was always aware of that requirement. Same thing with incident response. There's in policy called out, and it's like, hey, every team has to do an incident response test and has to test these scenarios. So again, a lot of these, not that they couldn't do it, but it was just an awareness issue. And of course, you don't want to identify those types of gaps during your internal audit or external audit, because then you have a finding, right? You want to get ahead of those types of things. So doing training and awareness up front, surveying users, that risk assessment is a great way to build awareness, identify those gaps, put them on your risk register, and develop plans to fix things.
So I'm hearing a lot in that last part about risk management as it relates to nonconformity with the standard.
Mm-hmm.
How does the standard itself help the organization manage risk from a cybersecurity perspective? Can you speak to that for a minute?
So I think it gets them, it turns on that mechanism in their brain. It's like, hey, we got to focus on risk. Do we have a basic asset inventory? Do we know where our critical data is? And sometimes organizations are really good at it. They'll have an inventory, but they haven't maybe categorized their inventory as like, how important is this app? And so it gets them into a real mechanism of thinking about inventory, data classification, risk, and exposure that may not have had the rigor before they decided to adopt upon it. There was always these rules. We have to follow these rules because they're organizational, but the importance of it wasn't always cohesive and well understood. So sometimes this goal of let's achieve the certification and let's maintain that certification is a good mechanism to communicate to not only to the business executives, but to sales, but to the development teams and to operational teams that have to maintain this security program, or the ISMS, as the standard calls it.
Understood. You brought up leadership, so I want to go there for a moment.
Sure.
How important is leadership in supporting the ISO 27001, 27002 for compliance purposes?
It's absolutely essential. If your leadership is not involved and engaged in cybersecurity and information security risk, you're not going to be successful with the certification. There's several clauses in the ISO 27001 standard that specifically calls out leadership involvement, their engagement, their review of security metrics. They ask about, how does funding occur? How does risk align to strategic priorities, making sure that security is integrated into the business. So you really have to get the leaders on board, because ISO costs money, and you also have to make it a priority.
Let's talk about culture.
Mm-hmm.
What role does the leader play, or the leaders play, in helping influence culture for security within their organization?
It's really getting buy-in at the top, to make security priority. Because as you could see that, we're trying to prevent something bad from happening, whether it's a loss of availability, a loss of, data integrity. There's a lot of emphasis on like configuration management controls in the ISO Annex A. And some leaders may say, hey, we've got to go fast. We got to be first to market. And the other side, there's operations says, well, we have to follow our processes. And so we actually having the goal of maintaining our ISO certification helps the operational teams to say, hey, time out. We just can't push to production. We need to follow our processes. This is not only our policy, but we also have the certification, and someone's going to come behind us and check. And simply having that concept that there would be an internal audit and there's an external audit causes executives to pause and say, okay, we're going to move fast, but we're going to do it safely.
Understood. Talk to me about how an organization, if they're looking at this standard, how they would integrate existing technology that they might have today with that standard. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. In terms of like integrating existing technology, first, of course, you have to start with like your gap assessment. That gives you a starting point. Understanding the requirements of the technical controls. The controls that in Annex A, they're not that I wouldn't call that high a bar, to meet. There's some new ones that might trip up an organization. Data deletion I've seen as being a challenge, or information deletion is the name of the control. Data masking, could be a challenge. So there could be attributes, but the good news about ISO is it's a flexible framework. And you could say, yep, we're moving from 2013 to the 2022 standard. You're allowed in the ISO world to put that control on your risk register and build a plan to remediate it. Other frameworks say you have to do all 110 things perfectly. ISO has that flexibility to say, yep, you can build a plan to gradually adopt and make sure your environment fully supports that specific security control.
Understood. Looking into your crystal ball, how do you envision that these standards are going to evolve in the coming future? Any thoughts?
I think the adoption of cloud services and the use of third parties, we're probably going to have more emphasis on controls in the 2022 standard. We really have just one control on the use of cloud services. I expect that to be further expanded upon. I expect privacy, as the regulations continue to grow and expand, will appear more. We do have a related ISO standard, 27701 for privacy information management system. I expect there's going to be more convergence of that standard into the 27001. I just don't see the trend for regulations in the privacy protection of data is just growing, not diminishing. So I expect the standard to be more specific in the future.
Understood. Last question for you, Tyler. If any of the viewers of our show want to reach out to you, how could they contact you?
Best way to find me is on LinkedIn. Look for S.Tyler Harding, and you'll find me there.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for coming in.
Thanks, Jim. Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Yep.
So that concludes today's episode. We extend our thanks to our guest, Mr. Tyler Harding, for joining us and sharing his insight on ISO 27001, 27002. We hope that today's program has been both enlightening and stimulating, offering fresh perspectives on all things cybersecurity. For more information about Cybersecurity Today and to keep up to date on upcoming episodes, please be sure to visit our show's website at www.cybersecuritytoday.org. Additionally, you can scan the QR code displayed at the bottom of your screen for quick and easy access to the show's website. Finally, we welcome your questions or comments via email at contactus@cybersecuritytoday.org. Feel free to reach out to us. We look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast. Thanks a lot for joining us. Stay safe, stay informed.